Okay, so imagine stepping into a future where your house is powered by clean energy, sunlight captured from your roof, maybe even supplemented by a local next-generation nuclear plant.
Hmm.
And compare that to just a few decades back, where keeping the lights on meant burning fossil fuels.
Yeah.
Now think about your meals. You've got vibrant fruits and veggies from a vertical farm nearby, and even your meat, get this, is cultivated cleanly without needing tons of land or impacting animals. That's a huge change from how we used to do things, wrestling with pollution and dwindling resources.
It really makes you think about how this vision, it sounds futuristic, but it's actually based on real possibilities. And that brings us to what we're diving into today. The main argument of abundance, why scarcity is chosen, and how to achieve more.
Right, we're going deep on this idea that the scarcity we see in things like energy, housing, healthcare, it's not necessarily a given. It's often because of choices we've made. So in this deep dive, we're going to unpack that. Why are we sometimes choosing scarcity, and how could we choose differently to create a future of abundance? We're looking at excerpts from this book by Ezra Klein and Thompson. It's a really interesting read.
One of the key points they make is that getting the future we want, it boils down to building and inventing more of what we need. Which sounds so simple, right?
Yeah.
But that simplicity could be revolutionary.
It does sound simple, and yet the authors say that the story of America, in the 21st century, it increasingly feels like we're choosing scarcity. We say we want certain things for the future, but our policies and actions often take us in a completely different direction.
Right.
And there's some really stark examples of this disconnect between our goals and what we're actually creating. Take climate change, for instance.
Yeah, it makes you question how committed we really are to saving the planet, We talk a big game about the climate crisis, but when it comes to actually implementing clean energy solutions, there's often pushback. You see things like liberal states shutting down nuclear plants that don't produce carbon emissions, and even solar projects running into local opposition. It shows this gap between the big goal and the actual choices being made.
It's not just energy either. Look at housing. We hear all the time that housing is a human right, a basic need. Yet, in our richest and most dynamic cities, it's become so hard to build new homes.
Yeah.
The authors point out this crazy statistic. In 1950, the median home price was about 2.2 times the average yearly income. But by 2020, that ratio had jumped to 6. That's a massive change in affordability.
It's important to remember that this isn't just about prices going up. It's about a fundamental mismatch between the amount of housing available and the demand for it, often driven by policies that limit construction. And when you look at the bigger picture, this scarcity has consequences for who can afford to live in cities that are full of opportunity.
For sure. And then there's healthcare. We all want better healthcare, breakthroughs in treating diseases and longer, healthier lives for everyone. But the authors argue that how we fund research and regulate healthcare can actually slow down promising advancements, delaying or even preventing breakthroughs that can make a real difference in people's lives.
Right.
And the cost is another issue. The average premium for employer-based family health insurance, it shot up from under $6,000 in 1999 to almost $24,000 in 2023. That's a huge burden on families.
Yeah, it's really important to look at the healthcare system's complexity. We're spending trillions of dollars on it. But are we really encouraging the kind of innovation and efficiency that would make healthcare more affordable and effective for everyone? It makes you wonder what our real priorities are within this giant, intricate system.
And then this pattern continues with education. Everyone agrees that good education is crucial for progress, both for individuals and society as a whole. Yet, college costs have exploded. The average yearly cost for tuition and fees at public colleges went from just a few $100s in 1970 to over $11,000 in 2023. These kind of increases can price a lot of people out of higher education.
It's almost like we're building a ladder to a rising elevator. We focus on helping people afford these things that are becoming more and more expensive, but we're not doing enough to address the root causes of why those costs are rising so much in the first place.
It's like we're so focused on helping people buy a piece of the pie that we've forgotten to bake a bigger pie. But the authors suggest that maybe, just maybe, there's a shift in thinking happening. People are starting to realize that we can't just throw money at these problems and expect them to go away.
It makes you wonder if we're finally starting to see the supply problem as a central political challenge. Things like the Inflation Reduction Act and the TTS and Science Act show a move towards investing in our ability to produce more of what we need. We'll have to see how effective they actually are, but the change in focus is definitely there.
Okay, let's dig into this economic pie idea a little more.
Hmm.
The authors really push back against the idea that society's wealth is like a fixed pie that just needs to be divided up more fairly.
Right.
They say this metaphor completely misses the point of economic growth.
What they're arguing is that economic growth isn't just about getting more of the same stuff. It's about transformation, creating a future that's fundamentally different from the past. A growing economy isn't just a bigger pie. It's a whole new menu with dishes we haven't even imagined yet.
Exactly. And to create that different and hopefully better future, technology is key. The authors say we can't solve big global challenges like climate change and poverty just by redistributing what we already have. We need new tools, new inventions, new ways of doing things.
Think about the falling costs of solar and wind power that's a direct result of technological advancements. Or the breakthroughs in battery technology that made it possible for California to ban the sale of new gas-powered cars after 2035. These aren't just small improvements, they're game changers.
And it's not just about redistribution, right? The authors emphasize that while fairness is important, building a better world requires both developing new technologies and making sure those technologies are widely available. We can't just divide up what we have now. We need to innovate our way to a more abundant future.
It makes you think about the relationship between technological progress and what we want for society. Marshall McLuhan, the media theorist, famously said, "There are no passengers on Spaceship Earth. We are all crew." In the same way, with technology, we have to actively shape how it's developed and used to make sure it aligns with the kind of society we want.
Okay, now let's talk about cities. The book revisits the idea of the American frontier, but this time it's not about wide open spaces in the West. The new frontier for creating wealth is in our cities.
It's interesting how things have changed. Historically, cities like New York offered higher wages that balanced out the higher cost of living. But as housing costs in these urban centers have gone through the roof, that balance is gone. People are essentially taking a pay cut just to live in these places.
And the authors argue that this isn't what cities should be. They should be escalators into the middle class, places where people can find opportunities and move up in life, not just exclusive playgrounds for the wealthy. When we make cities unaffordable through bad policies, we're basically closing the American frontier.
It's also crucial to recognize how important cities are for innovation. They're like creative hubs because of the unique mix of people and activities you find there, the sense of community, the competition, and the chance encounters that spark new ideas.
Like, think about all the generative AI companies clustered in the Bay Area. They're packed together, even though it's one of the most expensive places for businesses to operate.
Yeah.
These companies are willing to pay those high rents because the talent and knowledge concentrated there is worth more than the savings they'd get from moving somewhere cheaper. Like economist Ed Glazer has shown, people in larger metro areas tend to be much more productive, even after accounting for differences in education and experience.
It makes you wonder about the power of being physically close to other people, even in a world where remote work is so common. While the pandemic sped up the trend of working from home, now we're seeing a lot of big companies, even video conferencing companies like Zoom, calling employees back to the office at least part-time. There's a recognition that building strong relationships and working together effectively is harder when you're not face-to-face. Glazer has pointed out that for technology to truly replace the need for cities, it would have to overcome millions of years of human evolution that has shaped us to learn best from those around us.
And the problems in our dynamic cities, they have ripple effects, contributing to the overall decline in upward mobility in the U.S. The research of economist Raj Chetty is really eye-opening here. In 1940, a child had a 92% chance of earning more than their parents. That's amazing.
Wow.
But for children born in the 1980s, that chance dropped to just 50%. The American dream, this idea that anyone can achieve success, it's become much less certain.
Yeah.
And it seems like a lot of these scarcities, they're self-inflicted.
Yeah.
Let's look at some of the specific areas the authors point to, starting with zoning regulations.
Right. It makes you wonder about what zoning was originally meant for. It started out pretty basic, like deciding what types of buildings could go where, kind of like rules in a house that say you can't put the stove in the living room.
Right.
But over time, zoning became much more powerful. It became a way to limit how much housing could be built, basically a form of anti-growth regulation.
We see this in cities like Los Angeles, where fewer and fewer homes were built in each decade from the 1960s to the 1990s, even though the population was growing. Or look at places like Westchester County in New York. Their updated zoning laws basically reduce the maximum population allowed by millions, mostly by restricting new development to big single-family homes. And in Bergen County, New Jersey, apartments were practically banned on almost all of their land by 1970.
When you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, the spread of these restrictive zoning practices has played a huge role in making housing less affordable. By artificially limiting the supply of new housing, these rules push prices up and make it harder for people to find places they can afford to live, especially in desirable areas.
And California is like a textbook case of this. It used to be a leader in growth and innovation, but the state's population actually shrank in 2020 because home prices got so out of control.
Yeah.
It's ironic that in these progressive areas where you see signs saying things like kindness is everything, there's so little affordable housing, and homelessness is a huge problem.
This brings up a really important point the authors make about homelessness, which challenges a lot of common assumptions. They argue that homelessness isn't primarily caused by things like poverty, mental illness, or drug use on their own.
Right.
While those factors definitely contribute, the main driver is the cost and availability of housing.
They compare California and West Virginia, which is fascinating. West Virginia has much higher rates of poverty, mental illness, and drug use, but California has 6 times more homeless people per capita.
Wow.
And the biggest difference between them, the availability and affordability of housing. It really reframes homelessness as a result of policy choices, or rather the combined effects of many policy choices.
And then there's this thing they talk about, the homeownership paradox. We often think of owning a home as the ultimate financial security, but the authors point out the risks of putting so much of your wealth into a single asset that's not easy to sell. And because the value of your home is tied to how scarce housing is for everyone else, this system sets up a conflict between people who already own homes and those who are trying to buy one.
Okay, let's move on to the rise of environmentalism. The authors acknowledge the huge role the environmental movement played in addressing the serious industrial pollution we saw in the mid-20th century.
Right.
Think about the smog in Los Angeles and Donora, Pennsylvania, or rivers catching fire.
Yeah.
Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring and the first Earth Day were turning points in raising awareness and demanding change.
That historical context is really important to understand where the movement came from. It arose from a real need to protect people and the environment from the harmful effects of unchecked industrial growth. Laws like the Clean Water Act were big, necessary wins.
Absolutely. But the authors argue that environmental regulations, while initially meant to protect, have also become a major source of delays and obstacles to building important infrastructure and housing. They specifically mention the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQIA, which is supposed to make sure environmental concerns are considered in project planning. But what started as a tool for responsible development can now be used to block all sorts of projects, even ones that are good for the environment. The term Californication, which initially described sprawling, unplanned development, now captures the complexity and unintended consequences of these regulations.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, they touch on this degrowth philosophy, the idea that constant economic growth is the root cause of the climate crisis, and that wealthy countries need to shrink their economies. The authors push back on this, saying degrowth isn't a realistic solution and could even have negative political consequences, maybe strengthening the position of those who resist moving away from fossil fuels.
That's an interesting point.
Okay, so beyond specific issues like zoning and environmental regulations, the authors identify a bigger problem. The way process and bureaucracy seem to be holding us back from addressing important issues and implementing solutions effectively.
They talk about this idea of democracy by lawsuit, which is interesting.
Yeah.
They argue that the environmental movement, while achieving important things, unintentionally helped create a system where lawsuits became a main way to govern, which led to long delays and made it harder to carry out even popular initiatives. Figures like Ralph Nader were influential in this shift.
And this has contributed to what they call a procedure fetish in certain political circles, where the focus is on following procedures and rules to the letter instead of actually achieving desired results.
Right.
The government can get so caught up in navigating complex regulations and procedural requirements that it becomes less effective at, well, governing.
And when you look at the big picture, the authors point to the overrepresentation of lawyers in American politics as a factor in this. Legal training naturally emphasizes interpreting laws and following procedures correctly over focusing on tangible results. And this cumbersome, process-heavy approach can erode public trust in government when people don't see concrete progress.
The Green Dilemma really illustrates this point. Even initiatives aimed at fighting climate change and promoting sustainability can get bogged down in the same environmental review processes that were originally designed to stop polluting projects. It's a frustrating situation.
It makes you wonder how we can find a better balance between needing thorough reviews and environmental protection and the urgency of tackling big challenges like climate change. Often everyone agrees on the goal, but the processes make it incredibly hard to actually get there.
To see how these bottlenecks play out in real life, let's look at some specific examples. The authors provide several case studies. One is the issue of affordable housing in San Francisco and a modular housing project called Tahanan.
It's interesting how different progressive goals can sometimes clash. Modular housing could be a faster and cheaper way to address the huge housing shortage in California, but local labor unions sometimes oppose these projects, even when the factories making the modules are unionized. They prioritize local jobs over the urgent need to increase housing supply and lower costs. On top of that, regulations like San Francisco's 14B rules add a lot of time and expense to affordable housing developments.
Then there's the ongoing struggle with homelessness in Los Angeles. Heidi Marston, who used to head the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, described a system where funding comes from many different sources, each with its own auditing requirements that have to be met every year or twice a year.
So instead of focusing on actually addressing homelessness, the focus shifts to meticulously tracking every dollar to comply with each funding source's rules. This emphasis on procedure over achieving real outcomes is a pattern we see again and again.
The CHIPS BS Act, which is supposed to boost domestic semiconductor manufacturing, is another example. While its goals increasing domestic production, training workers, and making supply chains more diverse are good, the authors question whether adding so many secondary goals might make it less effective at its primary goal of making U.S. semiconductor manufacturing more competitive globally.
It raises the question of whether trying to do too many different things with one piece of legislation can actually lead to weaker outcomes. There's often a trade-off between being comprehensive and having a focused impact.
And then there's California's high-speed rail project, which has been a long and complicated story.
Yeah.
Years of delays, huge cost overruns, and they even started construction in the Central Valley, which seems out of order if the goal is to connect Los Angeles and San Francisco.
It's a good example of how having multiple goals and dealing with federal funding priorities can sometimes work against a project's main purpose. The federal government prefers projects that show they'll improve air quality in disadvantaged communities. So the initial focus was on the Central Valley, even though that wasn't the most strategic place to start building a high-speed rail system. Plus, relying on a bunch of high-priced consultants from the beginning added to the skyrocketing costs.
Right. And then there's the case of California's Employment Development Department, or EDD, which totally failed during the early stages of the pandemic.
Yeah.
When millions of people suddenly needed unemployment benefits, the agency's outdated and complicated IT systems, along with rigid rules and slow hiring processes, created chaos and huge backlogs.
Right.
Jennifer Palka's work on this showed how important it is to subtract, to get rid of unnecessary rules, and simplify things to make systems actually work.
It really highlights how sometimes the best way to improve government services is to make them simpler, to strip away the layers of complexity that have built up over time, often with good intentions, but ultimately making them less effective.
But it's not all doom and gloom, right? The authors also give examples of times when we've overcome obstacles and achieved amazing things. The development of mRNA vaccines is a perfect example.
It's interesting how people were initially skeptical about mRNA technology. Scientists like Katalin Karikó had to fight for a long time to get recognition for their groundbreaking work. Traditional scientific funding bodies, which often prefer more established approaches like DNA editing, mostly ignored her early research.
And yet, really quickly after the COVID-19 pandemic hit, mRNA technology became the basis for highly effective vaccines, a miracle of scientific progress that was developed faster than ever before.
Right.
Karikó and Weissman, who faced a lot of resistance, ended up winning the Nobel Prize. The authors call this the Karikó problem, a potential bias in American science against risky, potentially groundbreaking research that goes against the grain.
It's interesting how the private sector, through companies like Moderna and BioNTech, saw the potential in Karikó's work when traditional funders were hesitant.
Right.
This shows how important it is to have different ways to fund and support scientific innovation.
Then there's Operation Warp Speed.
Right.
Putting aside the politics surrounding it, the authors present it as a really insightful example of how the government can effectively speed up both invention and implementation of important technologies.
It makes you think about the role government should play in encouraging innovation. Operation Warp Speed wasn't just about throwing money at the problem. It was about a coordinated strategy that included investing in a bunch of different vaccine technologies, anticipating and addressing potential manufacturing problems, like making sure there were enough specialized glass vials from Corning and figuring out the complex logistics of distribution.
It's kind of a unique situation, right? A very successful government program that doesn't get a ton of praise across the political spectrum. The authors challenge the simplistic idea that its success somehow proves the government always stifles innovation, pointing out that the massive government spending and coordination were crucial to its success.
They have this idea of the government acting as a bottleneck detective, which is interesting. It's about carefully looking at what's holding back progress in different industries and designing policies to address those specific roadblocks. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but rather a targeted effort to identify and remove the specific things that are preventing each sector from moving forward.
They also talk about this really interesting policy tool, advanced market commitments, or AMCs. How do those work to drive innovation?
AMCs are basically about making solid promises to buy a certain amount of a new technology once it's been successfully developed. This can be especially helpful for incentivizing the creation of technologies that are currently too expensive to be commercially viable, or where there's a lot of uncertainty about whether there will be demand for them in the future.
Right.
A great example is vaccine development for diseases that are common in Africa. AMCs guaranteed that there would be a market for successful vaccines, which encouraged their development. More recently, we've seen things like Frontier's commitment to buy a lot of carbon removal technology. They're using this approach to encourage innovation in climate solutions.
So, taking all this into account, are the authors optimistic about the chances of seeing this shift towards a politics of abundance?
It makes you think about where our political landscape is right now. The authors suggest that the perceived failures of current liberal approaches, along with what they see as missed opportunities on the right, have created space for a new political way of thinking that's centered on achieving abundance.
Yeah.
They point to the growing YMBY movement and the fact that Democratic governors in several states have passed laws that make it easier to build housing as potential signs of this shift.
Right.
But they also warn that dismantling the existing system of excessive regulation and bureaucratic processes will be really tough. It will require people to be willing to rethink long-held beliefs and maybe even form new political alliances that cross traditional party lines.
Right.
Zooming out to the big picture, the authors emphasize that there's no one simple solution. Understanding exactly what's preventing progress in each area is crucial. They also draw parallels to the ambition and optimism we saw in past visions of the future, like those showcased at the New York World's Fairs. It's a reminder that real progress takes deliberate choices and a commitment to building a better future.
Right.
And they even touch on this idea of political orders, like the New Deal era and the more recent neoliberal consensus, suggesting that the potential decline of the current neoliberal order could open the door for a new consensus to form around the idea of abundance.
It's interesting to think about historical patterns and how these political shifts happen. Just like the New Deal eventually gave way to neoliberalism, the current period of crisis and perceived scarcity might be what triggers a new political order focused on actively building a more abundant future for everyone.
That's a really interesting idea.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, the main takeaway from abundance is this. The scarcity we see in so many areas of our lives isn't just a fact of life. It's often the result of choices we've made, particularly through overly complicated and often outdated regulations, a tendency to focus mostly on helping people afford things without addressing the underlying supply problems, and sometimes being too cautious about embracing truly groundbreaking innovation.
When you step back and look at the big picture, the possibility of creating a future of abundance is real.
Yeah.
But getting there will require a big change in how we think. We need to embrace building an invention, systematically identify and remove the roadblocks that are holding back progress in different areas, and cultivate a culture that strongly supports both ambitious innovation and making sure those innovations are implemented effectively.
And with that, here's something for you to think about. What's one area in your own life or your community where scarcity might be a result of choices that have been made? What steps, big or small, could you take to choose abundance in that area instead? Think about the balance between regulation and progress, and the role that both innovation and effective government action can play in creating a more abundant future for all of us.